Have you ever had a dream that felt like a memory? One that was so vivid, so intense that if you could just focus on it long enough, you might be able to feel yourself there. You might be able to feel the air around you and smell it. That's how the world seemed to move. As if for the moment, I was the narrator, the overseer, the playwright, or maybe the conductor of the world around me. There's something in these quiet moments. That's where the veil is lifted and the ether is revealed. To see the glimpse of it, you have to be able to walk between two worlds, knowing that any small trip may send you somewhere you've never been before. Clovers will be coated in stars and winds will feel like kisses in the night. Don't you dare to try? There's many definitions of the word liminality, but in its basic form, it represents something on the edge of a threshold. A feeling of transition that can be inviting, looming, anticipatory, all of it. It's right at the edge of infinity because it can all exist at the same time. Something I wanted to present as a thought piece is the idea of how currently we're in an era of conjuring these liminal ideas in a multitude of forms. Ones that extend past just a space, but rather can exist and encompass a current cultural philosophy. So to begin, we have to establish where ultimately we began, and then kind of touch on some sub-aesthetics, and then just kind of an end statement. If you were to Google liminal or liminal spaces, some images like these would appear. Most of these images will consist of the same topics. Some of living rooms that are a little bit outdated. They feel lived in, like the carpet's been ran through many a times. You can almost smell the dingy air that's been there for forever, tapping into this nostalgia almost. But on the counter side, there are these other liminal spaces that we have created that exist almost in a fantasy-like world where, for example, it's a field and there are these oversized desktops and they all have the Windows 98 logo, and then maybe you'll hear like the echoes of some kind of 1940 song. But yet there's still another space that exists. This third space exists not in a fantastical slide and not in one that seems so inviting, but one that makes you question why you're looking at it. One that makes you feel queasy even though you don't really know why, and one that makes you feel just a little small. Plenty of videos on YouTube will state that the idea of liminal spaces began as a Reddit post in 2019, talking about the back rooms, this space where you could clip out of reality and then you would be wandering these hallways for forever. That post on Reddit did not really gain traction or really any interaction until we entered the most liminal time in most recent years, 2020. That's really when this trend began to skyrocket, and really when it began a stir that almost was reminiscent to a level of creepypastas in the 2010s, you could say. Culturally, too, if we take into account the year 2020, it makes sense. 2020 was frozen. Speaking predominantly to my generation, but most of us were on this edge of adulthood, a tipping point of freedom, this completion of a cycle, and yet all of a sudden we were plunged into this chrysalis that we were not allowed to emerge from. Of course, 2020 was also a time of sadness, of tumultuous existence, of quiet meditations, and small, shy laughter. With such a massive pause, there was almost this sense of looming obligation as well. An obligation to do something important, whether that was something important in our community, in our own personal lives, online. As an artist, I definitely felt this pressure of, is what I'm doing enough? Don't I need to push farther? Don't I need to come up with some kind of magnum opus or something? Not to mention, I had just graduated from university. It was a time of my life where everything felt so infinite and so full of adventures, and in a split second there was no real sign off. There were no goodbyes. It was just over. It was so cold after feeling so alive. When discussing liminality as a concept, as an ideology, it lends itself to warp and contort to your own personal experiences. It's really interesting though to see how everyone relates to it personally, and yet we can all come together collectively and still agree in a weird way that this or that is liminal. I believe the reason for this though is that, as stated earlier, it's an aesthetic that ultimately taps into nostalgia. It taps into some form that we can all relate to. It's why, looking at this picture, you may get a sense of home, and I may get a sense of mildew carpet at a friend's house that I only ever visited once. In fact, liminality is really a bridge, one that exists very much so in the world that we interact with every day, and yet taken and exaggerated in fantasy in the arms of the internet. It's a space of youth that is mixed with this early digital influence. Now, moving into this next section, we're going to be talking about sub-aesthetics. We'll lightly mention a possibly triggering sub-aesthetics, but just viewer discretion. One thing I did notice though, on my journey of delving into liminality as a whole, is that there are many overlaps with sub-aesthetics such as weirdcore, glitchcore, dreamcore, and traumacore. Now, I never had heard of most of these until my 2021 Spotify Wrapped came out, where apparently glitchcore and I think dreamcore are both genres of music, but sure, okay, yeah, whatever. That's also when like Spotify had that really interesting design choice. It was a funky time, what can I say? But anyways, moving on. When delving into these aesthetics, it's very clear to see how liminal is the parent of all of these. It's those same spaces that we talked about earlier, just a bit more enhanced to specific topics, I would say. To begin, dreamcore seems most adjacent to vaporwave, oddly enough, which really you can definitely still see pieces of that art form being used again in the liminal space, which is just a fun almost Easter egg in a way of like how aesthetics never really die. It's like the 30-year fashion trend or whatever. It always will come back in style. But ultimately dreamcore is very much in this space of kind of fantastical, and Macintosh 420 would be playing in the background. I feel as though glitchcore and weirdcore though are like siblings, kind of like what are the two twins from? What are those two twins? Ray and Lin, is that right? Mikuhatsu? Anyways, it doesn't matter. Glitchcore and weirdcore are siblings. Let's just put it that way. They both lean into the internet. They both lean into the internet influence of things. A bit more glitching, no clipping, this mixture of old media meets new media. It's a lot of times an aesthetic that feels reminiscent of the ARG world of things, maybe even like a Five Nights at Freddy's kind of feel. Honestly, this may be a hot take, but it feels a little edgelordy. It does. It gives me like teenager vibes of, hey, I think the glitch effect is really cool. I'm not coming for anybody because I was that person not even that long ago. So it's just, that's a bit what it feels like. But lastly is Traumacore. Now, processing and expressing emotions is necessary, especially through art, because without art and without that expression, then how are we human? But that ultimately, it really is where Traumacore is rooted as an outlet. I've heard in the past how some people think that it romanticizes mental illness or these struggles, but seeing this community and seeing how they do not take these topics lightly, or the expression of these topics lightly, you can tell that this really is a therapeutic expression. Sadly, this sub-aesthetic touches on a lot of abuse of all kinds, and are usually ones that happened in early childhood. Because of such dark topics, it's typically contrasted with over cutesy items, or kind of those contrasting aesthetics, both representing the innocence that was lost and the age of which it was existing in. Now, with the sub-aesthetics out of the way, it's time to go backwards again. Since Liminality is rooted in nostalgia, as we've established, I'm going to speak a little bit about my own personal thoughts of growing up with a Wild West internet, and just on the cusp of being able to understand whatever I would stumble upon. Firstly, I would say that for me personally, I always found comfort in empty spaces, ones that have been left to time, ones that feel like they could crumble at any second. Just give me an abandoned place and I will obsess about it. Which in high school, there was this website called Abandoned Playground. It was trying to create the largest database of abandoned places and document their history and any photographs that people would find and whatnot. This is really cool. Admittedly, I can't say it's as neat now. It feels a little bit less user-friendly, but the idea, the concept are all really great. Anyways, taking into account abandoned places, the concept of urban exploration, and going and doing recording or experiencing these abandoned places, it really taps into that surge of rebellion, youth, just the urge to be a pioneer of something new, something unique. Urban exploration had its own surge of influence around the mid-2010s, which was also coinciding with another influence that we were talking about earlier, creepypastas. So let's merge the two. Let's make the connections here, shall we? Really, when you think about it, the two are a match made in heaven. It's like sitting around a campfire. You're at camp, okay? Sitting around a campfire. You're telling these scary stories. Are they true? Are they not? Probably not. But your mind at the age of like 12 can run wild with it, and it's like, holy shit, that's obviously true. That's really what creepypastas were, I feel like, in a way. Because it's like these long stories that were probably grammatically incorrect in lots of areas, there'd be like 1 or 2 images there, maybe even a video if you're lucky enough to stumble across one. And you know, at my age in high school at like 13, I'd be like, obviously it's true if there's like physical evidence, even though the evidence would literally lend to nothing. It'd be like a shoddy shot of the woods or something, you know, Blair Witch style. But point being, it's really where we see that bridge of reality and fantasy. That was stupid that I did that. Anyways, it's rooting itself in our very physical real world, but running with imagination of digital telephone. Of course, being in a more weirder, Wild West age of the internet, one that itself was on the threshold of existing or barely even knowing how to exist, it was much easier to stumble upon wildly contradicting pieces of media. You could go from something like Charlie the Unicorn to Salad Fingers to a live leak video back to like Neon Cat or something. It'd be like whiplash to the max. My point being, by consumption of all of these pieces of media, it transpires to art, to music, to the way we even begin to form a worldview. Now, saying liminal is a worldview may be a bit of a stretch, but it may very well influence how we interact in our day-to-day. Why? Because at the root core of liminal is existing in both what we know and what we don't. So there will always be a form of understanding. There will always be some relevancy to our life, just as it is now. Which ultimately is why I would dare to say that liminal is far more than just an aesthetic. It's not just something for us to all look at, but something that we can exist in. Something that we can examine as a new philosophy for how we interact collectively. And maybe, just maybe, if you focused on it hard enough, you might find yourself somewhere familiar, somewhere you've never been before, somewhere that may not have existed until just now, but maybe, just maybe, you had a dream about it. Then is it a memory? Is it an idea? Is it all of it? Can't one exist on that threshold of reality? No, I'm not gonna do it. But anyways. There you go.
I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start